Hey, Influence Decoders, welcome back for another deep dive. So, you know how this works, right? We take a mountain of research, reports, news articles, anything you send us,
Okay.
and we break it down, into the need to know info. And today's topic is all about people who weaponize fear,
Mhm.
or I should say, weaponize anxiety, I guess.
Mhm.
Fear forgers, as our source material calls them.
Ooh.
And this isn't just about, being informed, right? This is about understanding how these tactics work. So you can spot them out there in the wild
Mm.
and make clearer decisions.
Yeah.
Like when you come across something that seems a little fishy, you'll be like, wait a minute, I know what's going on here.
Right?
So we're going to cover some tricks that these fear forgers use to twist our thinking. We're going to look at some real world damage this has caused.
Mhm.
And best of all, we're going to equip you with some tools to push back and build your fear resistance.
I love that. It's fascinating how Fear Forgers, as the podcast we're diving into labels them, go beyond just reporting the news. They're actively creating and profiting from fear, which is kind of a scary thought when you think about it.
Right.
And it's not a new phenomenon either. I mean, throughout history, there have always been those who capitalize on fear. But what's different now in the age of 2047 news and social media is the speed and sophistication with which fear can spread and be manipulated.
It's true. It's like it's on steroids or something.
Yeah.
The podcast really paints a picture of how these aren't, some shadowy figures in the background. These are media giants, politicians, even those influencers that we follow. And here's the kicker. Their entire business model hinges on keeping us on edge.
Wow.
The more we're afraid, the more we click. The more we buy into their solutions. It's like a cycle that just feeds itself.
It's a business model built on fear. And that raises a crucial question for all of us. What important issues are being drowned out while we're fixated on manufactured fear? The podcast uses the Y2K scare as a prime example. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
A relatively minor technical glitch was hyped into a global panic.
I remember it vividly. People were stockpiling supplies like it was the apocalypse. It was crazy.
I know.
And the podcast points out that a $300 billion industry popped up practically overnight to fix a problem that barely existed.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It's a perfect illustration of how effectively fear can be used to create entirely new markets. And while everyone was busy prepping for a computer meltdown, did anyone notice that climate change was already becoming a serious threat?
Oh, that's a good point.
We were so focused on this manufactured crisis that genuine threats were being ignored.
Yeah, I feel like that happens all the time.
Right.
And it's not just Y2K. The podcast also delves into how the COVID-19 lab leak theory was weaponized. Fanning the flames of xenophobia and stuff.
Yes, absolutely. This wasn't just a scientific debate. It was a narrative deliberately crafted to create division and fear, and the consequences were real. According to the podcast, Asian hate crimes in some areas surged by 150%.
Wow.
This wasn't just online chatter. This was real-world harm inflicted on innocent people.
It's a stark reminder that fear can be a powerful weapon when it's intentionally manipulated. So how do these fear forgers manage to hijack our brains and make us so susceptible to these tactics? Like, it feels like we're almost wired to fall for this stuff.
Well, you're not wrong. It all comes down to our brain's fight or flight response, a primal instinct that's kept humans alive for millennia.
Right.
But in today's world, we're bombarded with a constant barrage of information, much of it designed to trigger that fear response.
Oh, yeah.
Think about it. We're constantly exposed to alarming headlines, statistics, and imagery. It's like our internal alarm system is stuck on overdrive.
It makes sense. No wonder we're all so stressed out. The podcast uses a term I found really striking, probability theft.
Ooh,
Have you heard of that?
I have. It's a brilliant way to describe how fear forgers distort our sense of risk. They zoom in on small threats while downplaying more significant ones, making us fear the unlikely while ignoring the truly dangerous. Think about how many times you've seen a headline screaming about a shark attack, while completely ignoring the much higher statistical likelihood of dying from heart disease or a car accident.
That's a great point.
It's all about manipulating our emotional responses.
Yeah.
Our brains are naturally drawn to those immediate, vivid threats, even if they're statistically improbable.
Right.
And fear forgers know exactly how to exploit that tendency.
Wow.
It's almost like they're stealing our ability to assess risk rationally.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, how do we fight back? How do we reclaim control over our own minds and emotions?
Right. Like, we know they're doing this, but it's like,
Yeah.
how do we stop ourselves from, falling for it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the podcast offers a hopeful solution, a set of strategies they call the fear inoculation drill.
Ooh, that sounds intense.
It is. But it's actually quite simple and practical. Think of it as mental strength training for the modern world.
Okay.
The first step is awareness, learning to spot the language and tactics fear forgers use. Once you start paying attention, you'll notice patterns. The use of emotionally charged words, a focus on worst-case scenarios, a constant barrage of breaking news alerts. These are all red flags that should make you pause and engage your critical thinking skills.
Oh, that's a good point. So it's about training ourselves to be more discerning about the information we consume. But what about those statistics? How can we avoid getting swept away by numbers that are designed to scare us? The podcast mentioned something called dread math.
Yes, dread math is all about putting statistics into perspective. Let's say you see a headline blaring 50% increase in X. Sounds terrifying, right?
Oh, yeah.
But before you panic, do the math. A 50% increase on what?
Mm,
If it's a 50% increase on a tiny number, the actual risk might still be incredibly low.
right.
It's about shifting our focus from the raw numbers to the actual probability.
So it's like taking a deep breath and asking, okay, what's the full context here? But
Mhm.
let's be honest, sometimes even when we know the statistics, the fear can still creep in. What are some other ways to counter those negative narratives?
Well, the podcast suggests a surprisingly effective antidote: humor and satire.
Oh, really?
Yes. It sounds counterintuitive, but laughter can be a powerful weapon against fear.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like when you can laugh at something, it suddenly feels less threatening.
Exactly. Humor has this amazing ability to disarm fear and expose its absurdity. Think about all the great comedians and satirists throughout history. They often use humor to tackle difficult or taboo subjects, challenge authority, and make us question our assumptions.
Right, they make us think about things in a different way.
Exactly.
The podcast actually shares a really cool case study. They talked about a group of their listeners who they call calm clappers. And this group decided to fight back against online fear-mongering. They're replacing panic-inducing hashtags with hashtag #ChillTheFood.
Wow.
Can you guess what happened?
I'm intrigued. Tell me.
Engagement on those fear-mongering posts plummeted by 70%. It's amazing how a bit of humor and collective action can disrupt those negative narratives.
That's incredible. It's inspiring to see how people are finding creative ways to push back. It reminds us that we're not powerless in the face of these tactics.
Totally. Speaking of inspiring examples, the podcast tells the story of a listener named Decoder Carlos, who took this idea of reframing fear to a whole new level.
Oh, yes. Carlos's story is fantastic. He lives in a town in Mexico where rumors of water wars were spreading like wildfire. People were terrified that they were going to run out of water.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it would be easy to get swept up in that panic. But Carlos decided to do something completely different. Instead of fighting the fear directly, he focused on solutions and community engagement.
That's such a smart approach. So what did he do?
Well, he started by mapping the local water reserves and then live streamed the data for everyone to see. This provided transparency and countered the misinformation fueling the fear. And then, get this, he organized a zombie apocalypse charity run to raise awareness and funds for water conservation.
Brilliant. He turned a potential crisis into a fun community building event. Not only did he address the underlying concerns about water scarcity, but he also brought people together and fostered a sense of resilience.
It's such a powerful example of how we can reclaim control over fear narratives and channel that energy into positive action. It's about turning anxiety into agency.
Exactly. Carlos's story is a reminder that we're not just passive consumers of information. We can be active participants in shaping the narratives that shape our world.
I love that.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the heart of the matter. What does all of this mean for you, our listeners, our fellow influence decoders?
It means that understanding the tactics of fear forgers is the first step towards becoming more resilient to their manipulation. It's about developing that critical eye, questioning everything you see and hear, and refusing to let fear dictate your decisions.
Yeah, it's about remembering that you have the power to choose how you react, how you engage, and how you share information.
And it's about recognizing that while fear is a natural human emotion, it can be exploited and manipulated for profit and control. By understanding these tactics, we can reclaim our agency and make more informed choices.
That's a great point. So to recap, our fear inoculation drill toolkit includes awareness of fear-mongering language, dread math to put risks into perspective, and a healthy dose of humor and satire to counter fear narratives.
Those are powerful tools. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Talk to your friends and family about these tactics. Share your experiences, challenge fear-based narratives, and create a culture of critical thinking and resilience within your own circles.
Yeah, I love that. The more we talk about these tactics, the more aware we become, and the less power fear forgers have over us. But even with all these tools, sometimes it feels like we're drowning in a sea of negativity. What can we do to filter out the noise and protect ourselves from the constant onslaught of fear-mongering content?
That's where technology can actually be helpful. The podcast highlights a fascinating tool called the Panic Patch. Have you heard of it?
I have.
Okay, well, it's a browser extension that flags fear-mongering language on websites. Imagine browsing the news and seeing words like apocalypse or unprecedented highlighted in red, alerting you to the potential for manipulation.
Ooh, that's incredible. It's like having a built-in BS detector for the internet.
Exactly. And what I find particularly interesting is that the Panic Patch isn't about censorship. It's not about blocking or hiding content. It's about empowering users to make informed choices about what they consume.
Right. It's about highlighting potential bias and manipulation, so we can approach information with a critical eye. I love that. But what if you don't have access to a fancy browser extension like that?
Even without technology, just being aware of the tactics used by fear forgers can help us filter out the noise and focus on what truly matters.
That's so important. It's about taking back control and choosing how we want to engage with the world around us. We've covered a lot of ground today, but it all boils down to this. We have the power to choose how we react to fear. We can let it paralyze us, or we can use it as fuel to drive positive change. It's like we're training our minds to be more, resilient and resourceful.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating journey into the world of fear forgers.
Mhm.
But before we wrap things up, I think it's important to remember that fear in itself isn't always a bad thing.
Oh, absolutely. That's an excellent point. Fear is a natural human emotion that's helped us survive for centuries. It can alert us to danger, motivate us to take action, and protect us from harm.
Right.
The problem, as we've discussed, is when fear is manipulated and exploited.
So how can we tell the difference? Like, how can we distinguish between healthy fear, the kind that keeps us safe, and the manufactured fear that's designed to control us?
That's a great question. It starts with developing a healthy skepticism. Question everything you see and hear, especially when it comes to information that triggers a strong emotional response.
Okay.
Ask yourself who is presenting this information, what's their agenda, what evidence do they have to support their claims.
So it's about taking a moment to pause and engage our critical thinking.